Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. I'm exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief. And today on the channel, I've got Dr. Mike Licona and Laura Robinson in discussion talking about what we can know from history about the truth of Christianity. And so Mike has been on the show before, and Laura, this is her first time. So Laura, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Absolutely.
All right, so just to introduce my guests just a little bit, and we're not going to do super long introductions. That's I don't like to do that on this channel, so we can reserve most of the time for discussion. Laura is a Duke PhD candidate in New Testament and is the co-host of the New Testament Review podcast, which I've got linked in the description of this video if you'd like to check it out. They have really, really great episodes on her podcast. It's really, really cool. So definitely recommend going and checking that out. And Mike has a PhD in New Testament from the University of Pretoria. He is associate professor in theology at Houston Baptist University, and he's the president of Risen Jesus Incorporated. And the link to his website is in the description of the video as well. Laura, we were just talking before we went live that you have 2 MAs. What's that all about?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time at Wheaton, and I liked it so much I did a victory lap. I did my first master's in biblical exegesis when I started there, just because I wanted to study the Bible. I wanted to just be a good biblical scholar, learn your languages, Greek, Hebrew, all that backwards and forwards. And then I ended up staying on basically because some other plans I had fell through. But I kind of felt like I wasn't done. I really needed to sort of be exploring the theological side more and how we actually interpret these texts, because, it's one thing to look at the Bible as a historian, but if you're going to do it from a Christian perspective, which I think matters because I am a Christian, there's a whole other layer of this you need to add on. There's a whole other interpretive tradition that just doesn't have all that much to do with exegesis, so it's worth looking into.
Yeah, and then Mike, you've got your PhD from Pretoria, but you only have 1 MA. So what's up? What's up with that, Mike?
Well, if you do it right the first time, you don't have to do a second.
Ouch! Ouch! All right.
Very honestly, it has always been the historical question that has just captivated me. The theological question is very important. It just hasn't captivated me. So I certainly respect Laura for having both. That's for sure.
Yeah. That's really cool. All right. Well, let me tell you guys about the structure for today's show, what we're going to plan to do here. This is a very, very informal dialogue. This is not a debate. This is just a conversation between 2 people that have some disagreements, but they agree on a lot. They're both Christians. But what we're going to do is Mike is going to give a presentation on an argument that he's going to give for the resurrection, for the truth of Christianity. And it's the same argument that you may have heard before if you're familiar with Mike's work. But we're gonna give that out as a kind of basis for discussion, and then Laura's going to come in and kind of interact with it and share her thoughts. And that's pretty much what we have planned for today. And then in the second half of the show, we're going to do some Q&A. So if you have a question for Laura, if you have a question for Mike, then I'll let you know when to leave those in the live chat. Don't do it right now. But if you want to send it as a super chat, then that's actually a lot easier for me to go back and find. So if you have a question, you want to send it that way, that's really cool. All right, well, let's get to it. So Mike, would you like to start us off here?
Yeah, I have done it this way before, Cameron. So do I share screen and then put up a PowerPoint, or how do we do this?
Yeah, go ahead and share your screen. I hadn't had that planned, so go ahead and start sharing, and I'll see what I can do. We'll do it on the fly. So on Skype, there's a little button that you can press.
Yeah.
Share screen.
Got it.
And let me see if I can pull it up here. And if it works, then nope. All right, well, keep it up.
Hang on,
keep it up.
It's not up yet. It's okay. Can you see it?
Yeah, I see it, but I'm gonna do some magic real quick to make it. Here we go. All right, now we got it. All right, good to go.
Okay, so you asked me to do like 10 minutes, so I'm going to squeeze this into 10 minutes, but I'm not going to just rush through a lot. I'm just going to give you some basic material. So I remember a few years ago, I was at SBL and John Meyer was given a lecture, and he said that doing history is, in a sense, like playing cards. And when we play cards, we always wish we had more cards. We wish the cards we had were better. but we've got to play the hand we've been dealt. And he says, as historians, we always wish we had more sources. We wish the sources we had were better, but we've got to play with the sources that we have. So the question is, what kind of sources do we have when it comes to the matter of did Jesus rise from the dead? And this is an important matter. I remember Dale Allison in his book, Resurrecting Jesus. Dale Allison, New Testament scholar who teaches at Princeton. And he said, talked about, we know that the disciples had some beliefs. They had beliefs that Jesus had risen and had appeared to them. What led them to that beliefs? He said, well, that's the prize puzzle of New Testament research. And a lot has been written on this stuff. Gary Habermas probably knows more about this topic than anyone in the world. He's been studying it for decades and working on his magnum opus now. And he says there's over 3,500 academic sources that have been written on the subject of Jesus' resurrection since 1975. Over 3,500. So that's quite a lot. So let's take a look at this. When we look at sources, I want to focus on one source, and that's Paul. He's the ace in our hand. And let me give you 4 reasons why I think Paul is really important. Number 1, he claimed to have been an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. He didn't say he saw Jesus' resurrection, but he did say that he saw the risen Jesus. And so he mentions this in a couple different texts. So he claims to be an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. And these come from his undisputed letters. Second, he was not one of Jesus' disciples at the time. He was hostile. In fact, he was out persecuting the church. He believed Jesus was a failed prophet, a false Messiah, and he believed it was God's will to destroy this movement because it was just a bad part, a sect of Judaism that had gone astray. And so he was out to persecute the church. And it was at that time that he claims to have had an experience that he interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to him. Third, what he reports is quite early, within 15 to 27 years of Jesus' crucifixion. And I get that from saying, as most scholars would say, Jesus was crucified in either April of 30 or April of 33. And then I'm giving dates here on where most scholars think a number of these letters of Paul's, to which I would appeal, when they were written. And so we're looking at somewhere between 15 and 27 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Paul's writing these letters, which is relatively early. And then fourth, Paul was on message with what the Jerusalem apostles were preaching. We know that Paul knew several of the apostles, those he calls the pillars of the church, Peter, James, and John. And he had met with them. He, according to Galatians 1, he went up to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. He spent 15 years with Peter. 14 years later, he meets with Peter, James, and John, runs the gospel message past them. He said that he'd been preaching to ensure he was preaching the same thing they're preaching. And he says they certified that what he was preaching was true. Now imagine this meeting. You got Peter, James, and John, and Paul talking history and theology. The Fab Four. I mean, even Bart Ehrman, a friend of mine, has said, I would have liked to have been there with Peter, James, John, and Paul. I mean, who wouldn't? Those of us who are interested in these topics, can you imagine sitting there and listening to their conversations? It would have been awesome. But Paul says they certified that what he was preaching is what they were preaching. Now, of course, we could say Paul maybe exaggerated that. And I think that'd be reasonable to ask that question. So what historians look for are corroborating data. And so we have some. There was a guy named Clement of Rome, and there's some evidence that suggests that he knew Peter. He was affiliated with Peter, the lead apostle. And he wrote a letter that has survived today called First Clement. Now, scholars debate on when this was written. You've got a number that say it was written in the late 60s, but a majority says it was written in the early to mid 90s. It doesn't really matter to me when it was written, but there are some significant scholars, and not just a few, who are now dating it to the late 60s. And I think there's some decent reason for that. So it's interesting to see what Clement of Rome says about Paul, since if it's true that he was affiliated with the Apostle Peter, what does he say about Paul? Does it line up with what Paul says? Well, he refers to Peter and Paul as the good apostles. So he's placing them on par, Paul on par with Peter. And he refers to Paul as the blessed Paul, the apostle. So pretty laudatory language. And then we look at a guy named, Polycarp. And Polycarp, there's a good chance that he was affiliated with the Apostle John. So some of the disciples were known later on to have disciples of their own. And Polycarp, later martyred, he writes around the year 110, and his letter to the church at Philippi, and he says he refers to the blessed and glorious Paul, and he says that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message concerning truth. Now, what we see Clement and Polycarp saying are precisely what we would expect if Paul was telling the truth, that Peter and John and James had certified that he was on message with what they were preaching insofar as the gospel message. That's not to say that everything Paul preached is the same as what they preached, but it is to say, at least with the gospel message, the essentials, that what Paul was preaching is what they were preaching. Put it a little differently, when we are hearing Paul on the gospel message, we are likewise hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. So now the question would be, wouldn't it be awesome if they found a lost manuscript somewhere, a lost document, a lost letter of Paul? Maybe, we've got our 1st and 2nd Corinthians are actually 2nd and 4th Corinthians. What if we found one of those lost letters to the church at Corinth? What if we found the lost letter to the church at Laodicea? That'd be pretty cool. And what if he said in there, hey, I want to, here's the gospel message. I want to lay this out for you. And he gives a brief outline. I mean, that would just be historical gold, because then even if the gospels, even if we were to chuck them and not believe them at all, we could still have confidence, at least, that when we hear Paul on the gospel, whatever he's saying about the gospel message, that this is likewise what the Jerusalem apostles were proclaiming. Well, we don't need such a document like that, although it'd be really cool to have it. But we don't need it because we already have what we're looking for. And it's in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1, when Paul says, now I want to remind you, brothers, of the gospel message I preached to you. And now he's going to lay out an outline of that message. He says in verses 3 through 5, I delivered to you what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared. Now, most scholars today who study the subject agree that Paul has given us some oral tradition here, perhaps a creed that has been formalized into this format. And the reason they do this is, first of all, you got these terms delivered and received, which were used for the imparting of oral tradition. You've got parallelism going on here, which you can see. You got long, short in this tradition. So you've got that, and then you've got a number of appearances that come right after that. He appeared to Peter, to the 12, to more than 500, to James, to all the apostles, and then Paul says, last of all, he appeared to him. So in this oral tradition, you've got Paul mentioned the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances to at least 3 individuals and to at least to 3 groups. So just to give you a little bit of idea how this is dated, you've got 1 Corinthians, which is dated between 53 to 57. You've got Paul established the church in Corinth. So when he says, I delivered to you what I also received, he delivered it to them around the year 51. And of course, he received it before then. So this creed in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, predates 51, which puts it within 21 years of the crucifixion, quite early. And it's very likely to have apostolic origin since it's coming from Paul and it was handed down to him. So from this, and Paul says, whether I or the other apostles, this is what we preach and this is what you believe, this gospel message. So I think Paul is our best source. He's hostile at the time of his conversion experience. So he wasn't biased toward Jesus when he had this appearance. He wasn't inclined. There was nothing emotionally in him that we would know of that would incline him to want to see Jesus risen from the dead. He's early. He claims to be an eyewitness. He knew Jesus' disciples, and it appears that Jesus' disciples, the pillars of the church, Peter, James, and John, certified that what his gospel message was on message with theirs. And from this, we can get at least two facts, and these go mostly undisputed amongst New Testament historians. One is that Jesus' disciples taught that he was raised from the dead, so we can know it wasn't a legend that developed over time. Legend doesn't take a lot of time to develop. Urban legend can develop immediately. But since we can trace this back to the apostles themselves, you can accuse them of hallucinating, lying, delusional, whatever, or not even really meaning resurrection in a literal sense. But it's not a story that developed over time. We're not going to say that Jesus, as some scholars have claimed, that the original claim was that Jesus was assumed into heaven, or that he was taken to heaven and vindicated there, and that's what they meant by resurrection. No, the original apostles were claiming that Jesus was resurrected. And then, second, we can see that the disciples taught that the risen Jesus had appeared to them in individuals and in groups. And so this really puts a strain, a severe challenge to the hallucination or vision hypothesis, since, number one, these appearances, that multiple studies by medical professionals, mental health professionals, have revealed that only approximately 7% of those bereaving the loss of a loved one will experience a visual hallucination. We're looking at 100% of the disciples here. Second, you've got group hallucinations, and because hallucinations are a false sensory perception, they occur in the mind of an individual. They have no external reference, so they're like dreams in that sense. I couldn't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a dream, I'm in Maui. Go back to sleep, join me in my dream, and let's have a free vacation. I couldn't do that, and you can't experience a hallucination simultaneously with someone else. And yet we have no less than 3 group appearances here. And then Paul. Again, we wouldn't expect Paul to experience a hallucination. He's not grieving over Jesus' death. Now, we can go through different hypotheses. The hallucination hypothesis is the most popular amongst non-believing scholars today. But it's probably the weakest, historically speaking, when you subject it to strictly controlled historical method. So, and we can get into that historical method and unpack it a little later if you want. But that would be, just in a nutshell, a case that I present for the resurrection of Jesus. If someone wants to go a little bit further with this, if they want to learn more, I'd say for a beginner, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus is a pop-level book written by Gary Habermas and myself back in 2004. We're going to update it in the near future, but that one's for beginners. The Sun Rises by William Lane Craig is also a pop-level book. It's kind of a popular version of a doctoral dissertation he did under the supervision of Wolfhard Pannenberg at University of München. So you got that. And then intermediate advanced reading, I've got a book. It's a slightly edited version of my doctoral dissertation. It's called The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach. You've got N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, and you got Resurrecting Jesus by Dale Allison. I think those are excellent. Of course, when Gary Habermas comes out with his magnum opus within the next 5 years, that's going to be the place to go, because it's going to be it'll probably be at least 5,000 pages. So, yeah. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, in fact, I just had him on the channel recently, and he's almost finished with the first draft, and then he's got to go through editing. And he was like, "Look, it might sound like that's good, like I'm about to be finished, but he said editing a 5,400 page book is going to take at least a year, so don't expect it to be out too soon." Well, Laura, would you like to come in and share any of your thoughts on what Mike has presented here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, being in a situation where you're talking with Michael Kona about the resurrection is always a little odd. I feel like I'm on a very surprising list of people, because I actually am a Christian and I do think the resurrection happened. So I think that is something that puts me apart from some of Michael Kona's normal conversation partners on this front. But I actually do think it's not necessarily great for our theology to make a lot out of the idea that we can trace all of this, that we can trace the historical resurrection as an event back to this early Christian reporting, and we have this rock solid reporting. I think what I hear Mike saying is that we really have to accept, we have so much good historical data that the resurrection happened, that to say that we have to exclude it from scholarly study is basically a procedural difference, right? That somebody says, no, we can't talk about the supernatural event. Because we have to talk about only things that are natural, that have natural causes. So, and that's almost not even a methodological argument. That's just a historical argument, that we have really, really good testimony that people knew that Jesus was resurrected. And I actually just don't know if we want to make that claim as historians. Do we really have this amazing diversified evidence of the resurrection? What we have is that Paul says he saw Jesus, right? Paul says Peter, James, and John saw Jesus. And, I know that Mike got into a little bit later that these people remembered as being pillars of the faith afterwards. But in these later Christian texts, they don't repeat visionary experiences. They don't repeat reports about the resurrection. They just maintain that these people stayed involved in the church. So Paul says Peter, James, and John saw Jesus. Paul says 500 people saw Jesus. We don't have any other independent story about what this might have been. We don't have any reports of who these people were. We don't have their accounts. We don't know what exactly they saw. It was definitely Jesus, but beyond that, not a lot of details. We don't know if they agreed on what they saw. We don't know if they persisted in their belief in what they saw after the fact. We just know that Paul says that he saw the 500. And then we have the Gospels, which are literally dependent on each other, and also second generation, secondhand at the very least, and they seem to all disagree with each other in some capacity, and we can argue about the significance of those, but at the same time, it's hard to make a great historical case that they tell us exactly what went down at the empty tomb, because they all say something a little different. So all this is to say, it seems like the best source we have for this is Paul. And the things that Paul tells us about what other people saw at the resurrection. And if we decide that what Paul is saying is so convincing and so enormous, we're putting a lot of weight on this one figure that I think we wouldn't normally put on, that we wouldn't normally put on any individual figure. And I think that Paul's testimony to us sounds so amazing because we're Christians, and because we are caught up in the fact that we believe in this resurrected God, and we think it's amazing. And but the payoff of it is that we really just have this one man's testimony, and then all of basically the hearsay he collected. And I wouldn't even say that would be enough to say for sure that Jesus was left-handed, let alone to say that he was definitely resurrected. So I think we're already in a problem right off the bat with trying to figure out how this how we can testify to the resurrection in history. If I could just make a little plug for how I would think about this, because I actually don't think it's important for us as Christians to be able to say that we can recover what Paul saw on the Damascus Road as historians. I think that the work that we do as historians that assumes methodological naturalism is perfectly fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, because it's based on the kind of ordinary history we do in day-to-day life, right? So in day-to-day life, we are dependent on natural explanations for what happens around us, right? So the police officers, when they solve a crime, if someone comes to a cop and says that my car was stolen, we assume that has a natural explanation, right? We would never entertain that some sort of supernatural thing is causing this. And that's just history. That's just relatively recent history. So if we jack that back and we think that we're going to study history by roughly the same tools that we study normal history right now, I think it's totally natural to say that the best tool we have for doing history is methodological naturalism. But I don't think that means that we need to be functional atheists when we look at history, because there's another way of doing history that we can draw on. And that's a theological account of history, right? So a theological account of history is not really about investigating what happened. It's about interpreting history after the fact. That we as Christians, we affirm that God has caught everyone up in every aspect of reality through the death and resurrection of Jesus, and that God is involved in every aspect of history. So we don't really make a distinction between history God's involved in, natural, and history that God's not involved in, supernatural. We say God's involved in all of it. But this is a retrospective claim. This is a claim that we make right now based on our own Christian presuppositions, and we can look back and narrate through history to figure out how God was involved, and we can ask theological questions about it. And I just don't know why that's not enough for when we're talking about the resurrection. Why can't we talk theologically about what Paul says happened, and let the resurrection itself not be something that we need to be able to reconstruct the way we can reconstruct the siege at Jerusalem, for instance? So that's that. I realized that I got fired off very quickly because I had a lot I wanted to say, and I started screaming, which is a thing I do when I'm very excited. But so, yeah.
No, yeah. So, Mike, how would you like to respond to that? It sounded to me, Laura, like you were saying that when it comes to these types of apologetic arguments, maybe it's trying to give like too much confidence in a field that we don't have that much confidence about.
Right, or that it encourages us to put our faith in a form of knowledge that I think is routinely changing. You know, all historical claims are necessarily tentative. We're always working with the best data we have. So I think if we really want to say that, you know, we use the tools of history and we recovered this historical event, we found out that it turned out Jesus was revivified, we always have to be open to the possibility we might find out something else that might challenge that assumption. You know, that's actually not a great thing to place your faith in. And I would argue it's not even really what the early church placed their faith in. You know, they continuously had this experience of Jesus being involved with them in church meetings and in worship and in prophecy. And that's what they really went after. So I think that we might be making some modernist missteps in making Christianity all about stuff we can do in a university by saying that the best reason to be a Christian, the best reason to believe that Jesus is resurrected is because we have this great data for it. And then, of course, I think the other part of this that makes it so difficult is the fact that we actually just don't have that good of data for it. We have Paul. And that's fine if you're talking about Paul, but it's not great for history.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, well, I just think this is a wonderful, beautiful example of the difference between a historian and a theologian.
Okay.
Because I'm approaching this historically, whereas I think you're looking at it more theologically. So let's talk about a couple of these things. You mentioned about it. We have to, you know, as Christians, we interpret this, and God is acting in history here. I agree with you. If we're looking at it practically speaking and theologically speaking. But as a historian, I can bifurcate the historical from the theological. So, for example, take the claim, Jesus died for our sins. Now, I can't affirm that entire statement as a historian. I can take that by faith. But I can adjudicate on half of that statement. I can adjudicate on the portion that says Jesus died or Jesus died by crucifixion. I can look at the historical data and conclude that Jesus died by crucifixion while saying the claim that Jesus' death atones for sins, well, that's for the theologian. That's for faith, where faith comes in. But I can't verify that. I might be able to verify that Jesus believed his death atones for sins, or that the early Christians believed that Jesus' death atones for sin. But as a historian, I don't have the tools to be able to verify that Jesus' death indeed atones for our sins. Regarding methodological naturalism, I agree, but I think that methodological naturalism, we've got to take a little more prudent approach to it that's less infused with worldviews than is typically done. What most historians, or I should say biblical scholars, well, even some historians who deal with this, and the matter of historians and miracles is something that is a live discussion even amongst philosophers of history at this very time and has been for the last 2 decades, a living discussion. But a lot of philosophers of history, biblical scholars will say that you got to go with a methodological naturalism that if miracles involved, you can't adjudicate on it. Okay, so I think what a historian can do is they can look at the data and adjudicate on whether the event occurred. They just wouldn't be able, as a historian, to be able to adjudicate on the cause of the event. So let me give an example. let's suppose that astrophysicists have been keeping track of a comet for a decade, and within the last year, they've determined that the comet is on a crash course with our moon. And they've determined that it is going to crash into the lunar surface at a specific time on a specific day. And at that time, the Hubble Space Telescope and a bunch of planetariums around the world are zoomed in on the lunar surface, and they watch that comet slam into the moon. And as the dust settles, there's a message on the moon's surface that says, and it's in Hebrew and in Greek, it says, Jesus is Lord. Now, an astrophysicist could look at that, a cosmologist, and say, I have no idea how that happened, how that statement appeared in Greek and Hebrew on the moon's surface. But you wouldn't turn around and deny that the comet crashed into the moon's surface and left that message. You would say the event occurred, you would leave the cause undetermined because you don't have the tools as an astrophysicist to determine that God caused it. Now, of course, you could take your lab coat off as a physicist and say, but I do think that God is probably the best explanation. But in doing so, you're not using the tools of a physicist. In a similar way, I think the historian can look at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and conclude that Jesus rose from the dead and leave the cause undetermined. Now, I think you could take your tweed jacket off as a historian and say, well, yeah, God's probably the best cause for it, especially given some of Jesus' claims, but we can't have the tools as a historian to verify that God did it. Now, I can respond to a bunch more of these, but maybe rather than doing that, give Laura a chance to respond to these, and then we can just cover some of these other things she mentioned.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the place I would want to start is that I definitely hear the idea that historians could, of course, record some anomalous event in history where a person was dead and then they stopped being dead for whatever reason, and we don't really know why it happened, but it did happen. The thing I just don't know is if we actually have really good data to think that that has to have been what happened at the resurrection. Like the vast majority of the claims that Paul makes about Jesus in his letters, in the way in which Jesus is involved in the church, doesn't have anything to do with this historical moment where Jesus was dead and then he wasn't. They talk about the resurrection, but Paul just kept on interacting with Jesus. He says to the Galatians that Jesus was clearly presented before your eyes as crucified. They keep having these visionary experiences in the church.
I don't know that that's referring to a vision. Couldn't it just be the apostolic preaching?
I think the before your eyes thing is really suggestive, and we do have, the language in that passage of how did you receive the Spirit. I think there's probably something charismatic going on there. That would be my hunch. And we also know that Paul had visions well after the fact. He went to the third heaven, for instance. So I would assume that this involvement with the resurrected Jesus continued well after that first Damascus Road experience.
But these appearances, even if we go with Galatians and say when Jesus appeared before your eyes. Remember, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:8, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. So in terms of resurrection appearances, it appears that Paul, whatever nature was the appearance to him, that was the last resurrection appearance of Jesus in that kind of form. And I don't know what these others, like these ecstatic experiences within group settings, I don't know of any. Maybe you can provide an example. I don't know of a single example where that's referred to as an appearance of the risen Jesus.
I mean, one thing that does come to mind is the language in Matthew about where two or more are gathered, there I am with you. And, I think we tend to cross-stitch this onto pillows because we think it just sort of sounds like a nice reference to Jesus being, present in spirit. But when we have this language in Matthew that a lot of the authority of Jesus is being handed off from Jesus to the church, that on this rock I will build my church, and whatever two of you agree on will be, whatever you bind will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose will be loosed in heaven, or whatever you agree on, that this becomes this new law. There's this very strong norm throughout the Gospel of Matthew that whatever disciples do together and whatever they agree on, that is something that Jesus is still intimately involved with. And you also see this showing up again in John, that in John you've got the language of, the Holy Spirit will help you to remember everything I said. And, I think we can all see by the extent to which the tone changes a bit in the teachings in John versus the teachings in the Synoptics, that probably some of that was not strictly speaking remembering, but also interpreting and hearing new prophetic words from Jesus. I think this is something that probably went on very well after the fact in the resurrection. And I also don't think that's something we need to be ashamed of or embarrassed of as Christians.
I agree,
yeah.
but I don't know of anywhere where those are referred to as resurrection appearances. They're manifestations of the Holy Spirit, for sure. The Holy Spirit will remind you. The Holy Spirit I'm sending the Comforter to you.
Yeah.
But I don't see these as being recognized or claimed to be appearances of the risen Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know there's probably some distinction to be made here between what's an apostle and who sees Jesus. Because you do see, it looks like those are things that Paul is using in different categories, even though the thing that gives him this apostolic authority is being one who saw Jesus. Yeah. I don't know. I'm also not totally convinced that Last of All is doing that kind of canon closing work there. I'm not sure if I get that, if Paul is speaking from his perspective. I'm not sure I buy that interpretation, but I'd have to look a little bit more into it. I don't know. It just, to me, it seems incongruous with the extent to which the Spirit is involved in the founding and the establishing and growing of these churches, that it seems odd to me that there would be some sort of sense that something had already decisively stopped with what was happening with God's revelation to the church, especially when we think about the fact that, Paul is writing from perspective where he thinks that the parousia is going to happen any minute now, right? So it seems weird to me that
he gets to 2 Corinthians. Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah, and then there does seem to be a bit of fudging, but for the most part, it seems like Paul has a very strong sense of the immediacy of the parousia, and that to me seems very incongruous with the idea that Paul would already have this category of kinds of appearances in his head that had come to a close. That just doesn't. I think that those are distinctions that are happening in salvation history that just seem a little premature from somebody writing so early on and who doesn't think that history is going to be around that much longer. So, I don't know. Yeah.
Let me ask you this: how do you imagine Paul thought of Jesus's resurrection? Was it a bodily event?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's definitely physical in some sense, but the amount of distinction he makes about what the body is like after the resurrection, it's a lot more complicated than a revivification. It's not what happened to, it's not what's narrated in Lazarus' story.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Do you think that Paul imagined that the nature of Jesus' resurrection was such that wherever Jesus was buried, that body was gone when he was resurrected?
Yeah, I think this is a really tough thing to say about, just because Paul doesn't give us a lot to work with. Obviously it doesn't take very long before his interpreters say that definitely had to be the case. I don't know. The obvious analogy is what Paul says about our bodies at the resurrection. But in there, I think the data can be a little ambivalent, because on one hand we have, in a moment we will all be changed, but we also have this image of how the body dies, and then this body dies like a seed, and then this very unlike thing comes from it. So I think you could probably take the data both ways. I say the creeds when I go to church. I affirm that there's a historical resurrection, but I don't think it's necessary that Paul had that figured out. I don't think Paul really wanted to be resurrected in his body. He says a lot of very nasty things about it. He says
I think that's what 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 5:8's about. I think he's fearful. He's fearful he's going to be disembodied when he dies, because Christ will not have returned by then. Let me throw something past you, because I do think that Paul imagined Jesus' resurrection in a physical, bodily sense, that the corpse would have been gone from where it was buried, and that it would be transformed into a resurrection body. Let me tell you why. And even even my friend Bart Ehrman would say that too. He thinks Paul's crystal clear on this. You've got First Thessalonians 4:13 through 17, where Paul says, I don't want you to grieve as those who have no hope. And then he says, Christ will bring back with him those who belong to him, right?
Yeah.
And then he says, then the trumpet will sound and the dead in Christ will be raised first. Now, wait a minute. If he's bringing the dead back with him, then how are the dead in Christ going to be raised? Because he's bringing them back with him. Yeah. I think that's pretty easy, because Paul says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, for 2 Corinthians 5:8. So he imagines that when a person dies, of course, they leave their body, the spirit leaves their body, and he imagines that body, the spirit, going to be with Christ in heaven.
Yeah.
Even in Philippians 21, 22, where he says, I'm in prison and I don't know which to choose. I have the desire to die and be with Christ, but to remain on in the body is much more necessary for your sake. So his conception of what happens at death is the spirit leaves the body and goes to be with Christ. And then when Christ returns, he brings the spirit of those who belong to him back with him. Those spirits are then put back into the corpses, which are resurrected and transformed into an immortal, glorious, powerful body that's animated by the Holy Spirit. So it's a bodily resurrection. It's like what Paul says in Romans 8:11. The Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. So I think Paul, whatever the nature of his experience was, he still believed that Jesus had been raised bodily, physically from the dead. And if this is what Paul believed, remember, he's preaching the same gospel message as the Jerusalem apostles. So this is what they believed. And that seems to me that a physical bodily resurrection would be very congruent with what we find in the Gospels, where they can touch him. He appears before their very eyes. And yeah, it is a transformed physical corpse that can do all kinds of things like appear and disappear at will. So it's still physical. It's more congruent with the empty tomb narratives in the Gospels than it would be with, say, they were just experiencing the presence of Christ when they got together and worshiped.
Yeah, well, no, and I definitely agree that it's more than the Spirit of Christ, but I also think I think sometimes we buy into a bit of a false dichotomy when we're talking about the physicality of the resurrection, that either it was a real resurrection, either the body of Jesus got up and then it was alive, so you would not have been able to find his body anymore because it was running around doing things, or it was this sort of metaphorical resurrected in our hearts, sort of a lame, not terribly interesting resurrection. But I think that's a mistake, because that's not always the way that materiality in ontology works in the ancient world. Spirit, pneuma, is still stuff. It's very light, airy stuff, but it doesn't exist on some sort of metaphysical plane for them. So, when Paul talks about angels having one kind of glory or the stars having one kind of glory, I think there's every reason to think that that's the kind of material that Paul thinks resurrected bodies are made out of, and not necessarily the part of you that died. So, and again, I'm not saying that it has to be true that I don't know if Paul knew an empty tomb tradition or not. I think there's a possibility. I don't know if Paul knew about the idea of the body missing or not. I think there's a possibility. I don't think it's essential for what he's preaching, though. I think that's a difference. And again, I'm not saying it doesn't mean that we as Christians can't believe it. I'm not saying that it's not something that should be part of our creeds, but I think we need to be honest about the limitations of what Paul is interested in. Paul is always very contingent. Paul is not laying out these systematic theologies to cover all of his bases. He's talking about the things that are most important at any time. So I think if we're trying to draw a lot out of this and say, that Paul would have talked about this with the Jerusalem church, and he would have made sure he was saying the same things they were. They would have said things that Paul didn't say, that they would have seen things Paul didn't see and would be attesting to this. I think we're ignoring a little bit the extent to which Paul is a contingent theologian. Paul talks about the things that are immediately in front of him. So that also seems like another thing we need to pay attention to.
I agree with you. And I agree with you that Paul does come at it that way as well. Mm-hmm. And here again, I think we see the difference between the approach of a theologian versus the approach of a historian. because I'm interested in the historical question here. And I do think that the data is sufficient to conclude certain things about what Paul believed. I mean, it seemed to me, Laura, and please correct me if I've misunderstood you here, because I respect you. I love your advisor, Joel Marcus, and also your reader, Mark Goodacre. I've never met Joel Marcus, but Mark Goodacre is a friend, and I really love the guy, and he's a fantastic scholar. Even though I think he's wrong on the synoptic problem, I tease him on this, okay, and I'm teasing you with that. You guys could very well be right with the Fowler hypothesis. I'm just not convinced of it at this time. But anyway, great guy. You're great. But when Paul says he met with Peter, James, and John, ran the gospel message with him, and they gave him the approval that he's preaching on message with what they're preaching. And when we have external corroboration that Paul's teaching the message of truth, don't you think that is sufficient to say that when we're hearing Paul and at least the gospel message, not necessarily all of his theology, but on the gospel message, we are likely hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. They're proclaiming the same thing. I'm not saying absolute certainty, because when you do history, you don't get certainty, but you do get probability. And I think it's highly probable, based on our data, that Paul is proclaiming the resurrection. The apostles are proclaiming it. And given what Paul seems to believe about resurrection, it seems to be a physical bodily event. Ours is, right?
Yeah. It can be physical and bodily without necessarily involving a person's corpse, I think. I think this is a live interpretive possibility. I'm not saying it's what Paul necessarily means. I just think it's on the table. So, but as for, Paul saying that, he went to the Jerusalem church and he wanted to make sure he was preaching the same thing as them, I think we're a little bit reading Paul against Paul if we think that the reason why Paul brings this stuff up is to emphasize accord with the Jerusalem church, because he only talks about it when they're all mad at each other, right? It seems like, if anything, there's a lot of dispute happening there, and there's a lot of disagreement happening there. And, Paul never gives us any clear indication that they disagreed about some core gospel message, but apparently at some point they did, because they didn't really know what to do about Jew-Gentile lines. They didn't really know exactly how Gentiles became part of the church. So It does look like some important stuff didn't get discussed. So we just don't know what they talked about. Paul gives us a nice summary in 1 Corinthians 15, where he says that, that Jesus died according to sins and was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. That's all sort of that central stuff there. But a lot of the details we just don't know.
I agree with you. I agree. I think we're in agreement here. So, and I said that doesn't mean what I'm claiming isn't that they agreed with Paul. Paul agreed with them on everything. Obviously, there were disputes. There in Galatians 2, he disputed to Peter's face, right?
Yeah.
So there were this, but I'm saying at least on the gospel essentials, they were in agreement. Paul was on message with this, and that included the resurrection of Jesus. So we might not know all the details. Now, I would say this: if Paul believed in a bodily resurrection of Jesus, then and that it happens to his corpse, and like he says in Philippians 3:21, we eagerly wait a Savior, the Lord Jesus, who will transform our humble bodies to be conformed to his glorious one. It's a transformation that takes place of this body. We will be changed. It's not that we're shedding this like a disembodied and then put on something. Paul uses the language in 1 Corinthians 15 about clothing over ourselves, to put something over, and that death and mortality is swallowed up with immortality. So it is a transformation of our corpse. The dead will be raised and we will be changed. It seems that's bodily, that would leave behind an empty grave. And let me throw, you said about the Gospels, literarily dependent on one another. I'm sure there's some literary dependence. I mean, that's obviously with the synoptic problem, of course. I differ from Mark Goodacre in thinking that even though John probably knew of the synoptics, I think he writes independently of them. And in fact, you've got Craig Keener, a friend of mine who has written a pretty robust commentary on the Gospel of John, where he focuses mainly, he's more interested in historical stuff than theological stuff, but he does some bean counting as well as scholars, and he will say that the majority of critical scholars today, although they reject the traditional authorship of John the son of Zebedee being the author of John's Gospel, the majority of critical scholars do think that whoever wrote John's Gospel, they used one of Jesus' disciples, an eyewitness, maybe a minor disciple of Jesus, as their primary source. So John's Gospel would still be rooted in eyewitness testimony. And I just had a master's student who wrote his thesis on some prolegomena on Mark, and he consulted over 200 critical scholars since 1965. And he found that the majority of them today, a small majority, but still majority, think that the evidence is persuasive to conclude, enough to conclude that Mark's primary source for his gospel was Peter. And if they are correct, then we've got Mark and John that at minimum are rooted in eyewitness testimony, and both of them speak of an empty tomb, which is congruent with Paul's belief that Jesus had been raised physically from the dead.
Yeah,
Laura, are you chomping at the bits to respond to that, or can I ask you a question? It's all related.
Not a lot. I mean, I don't really want to get into a big conversation about who wrote the Gospels, because I think that there's a really good case to be made that I think the apostle who seems to be behind Mark actually seems more like Paul than Peter. But that's all there is to it. So we don't have to get.
So you two you're both Christians, but what we're kind of like looking at in this show is like, well, what are some of the differences between two Christians that have different views? And so I think one of the biggest differences that we're kind of seeing right now is methodology. And one of the things that Mike has said at least twice now is that he's coming at this from a historical perspective and you're coming at it from more of a theological perspective. What are your thoughts on that distinction? Do you agree with him?
No. I think I am approaching the resurrection from a theological perspective because I think that's the only place you can approach it. I think when you're approaching the circumstances of Jesus' death and what the early Christians thought they saw, of course this is a historical question. Of course this is something that we are engaging with as historians. And again, I think that a big part of why it is so important to foreground this, to just be honest about the fact that we do presuppose Jesus when we look back at these resurrection claims, and to let that do our speaking for us is because history can't get us there. That history really can't get us to a lot of the most key ideas that we have as about Jesus and who he was and the work he did, and that's okay. That's fine. We just need to be really honest about that. And I think when we're doing history, it's okay to let methodological naturalism be normative. And even if you don't want to say, well, then now you're letting procedural details take over here, we have to do a lot of groundwork to get us to more than one witness of the resurrection. And that seems like a problem to me. And I also do think, again, I think that we're not talking enough about divisions in the early church about stuff. Paul says in Galatians 2, he also says that Peter was not walking in the truth of the gospel. This was a very serious dispute. And the fact that table fellowship isn't really a huge deal to us doesn't mean it wasn't really central to them. So I don't want to impose our assumptions about what the most important things must have been onto them, and they must have all agreed on this. Just because when we look at the data, it's a bit more complicated than that.
One of the questions I have, and Mike, if you can just real quick.
Can I?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
We only have one eyewitness that Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and that is Caesar himself in his commentary on the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't even mention it. He mentions himself being in Ravenna, and then he mentions being in Ariminum, which he has to cross the Rubicon to get there. But he doesn't even mention the Rubicon crossing, and he's the only eyewitness we have to it. Now, but I don't think you would question whether Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Nor do I think you would say, if we look at the data, all we can conclude is that there were some people back then, like Cicero and Suetonius and Plutarch and Dio, who believed that Caesar had crossed the Rubicon. But we can't really say that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. No, we would apply strictly controlled historical method. We would formulate hypotheses. We would weigh those hypotheses according to historical method to see which one is the best hypothesis, and the one that best explains the data would be regarded as that which probably occurred. Why wouldn't we do that with the resurrection?
I think we can. I don't think there's any reason why we can't. But I think that the hard thing is we're talking about events. So I think with the example of crossing the Rubicon, you're talking specifically about who had control of Rome at a certain time and who was in charge of Rome. And these are all things that I think we can have pretty good. We can get some more data about that. But the primary sources of how we know about the resurrections are personal, individualized testimony and people saying that they saw Jesus. It doesn't really look, except for giving the Spirit.
When we're talking about testimony, though, how do we know who was ruling Rome at that time in the power struggle? Because of testimony.
Yeah, but also when you have, this is not a subjective experience though. This is an objective experience that people are keeping records of these things. In Jesus,
that's what we got with Paul in the Gospels. People are keeping records of what happened. The Gospels are 4 lives. They're biographies of Jesus, right? Whether you believe them or not, they're still biographies of Jesus. That's the genre.
I definitely agree, and that's all very good evidence that Jesus had this historical ministry and that Jesus went around doing and was, widely known to be performing miracles and teaching and doing all these wonderful things. But I think once you get to the resurrection, things get a little bit more complicated, specifically because they do disagree. Because we do have this literary dependence and the extent to which these gospel writers do disagree with each other so much. But when we're talking about Paul, the things
they disagree
that
on Caesar crossing the Rubicon. They disagree quite a lot on the assassination of Caesar as well. Appian, Dio, Cicero, Nicolaus, Plutarch, Tacitus, Velleius, they all disagree on many details about the assassination of Caesar. Yet we wouldn't question whether Caesar was assassinated.
Sure. I mean, this is, I'm not super great on pre-imperial Roman history, so I'll take your word for that on that. But I do think what you can have, though, is when you have radical disagreements about how exactly something happened. There aren't any witnesses that disagree that Caesar died of old age, right? When you have those sort of extreme differences, that does change things. So
and we don't have any differences that says the tomb was not empty or that
did Jesus appear
from the dead.
Yeah, but did Jesus appear at the tomb or not? Like, that's a pretty important difference. I think if people saw Jesus or not at the tomb, according to Mark, nobody did. According to Mark, the women ran off and they didn't tell anybody. So that's a pretty extreme difference, So, and again, I think that the best reason we have for being Christians is because we're participating in this faith, that we're participating in this tradition, that people interact with Jesus now. I think that's a really big part of this. I think that's a big part of why people were Christians. And when you look at Paul, it took Paul 3 years to go check out what the other disciples were getting up to see if they had seen Jesus too. He didn't really worry about it. So I think that
does that mean they weren't claiming it? I mean, if he's out persecuting them and if he's based in Jerusalem and he knows the Jerusalem church, I mean, the leaders are based there in Jerusalem. He knows already what they're preaching because he's against it. So it's not like he hasn't a clue on what they're preaching. He knows what they're preaching. He doesn't like it.
Well, I don't know if we do necessarily know what exactly they're preaching and what is making him so mad. I don't know if we know that the thing that made I don't know if we know that the thing that made Paul oppose the early Christians was specifically the question of the resurrection. It actually seems like the thing that gets Paul in trouble later on in life is all about circumcision. So it looks like we do have these very specific cases of things related to law observance, or the thing that puts Jesus on a cross, on a Roman cross, is claiming messianic status. But it doesn't seem like it happens to any of the other disciples. None of the other disciples end up getting crucified. So I think by the time
Except
got
Peter, perhaps.
Well, so yeah, I mean, we have some legendary accounts on that down the road, and maybe.
Well,
but
you do have John 21, first century source.
Yeah. So we have some kind of a he dies violently, so we know that. We don't
dies
have
violently. You've got Clement of Rome and First Clement, who alludes to the martyrdom of Peter and John, Peter and Paul.
Yeah, again, we've got them dying violently from zeal, whatever that is.
Acts mentioning James, the son of Zebedee, being killed with a sword, right? So that's a violent death. So we already have there. You got what? John Acts, Clement. You got 3 first-century sources mentioning the martyrdoms of 4 believers. Oh, and that's the disciples. Remember, Josephus mentions the stoning of James, the brother of Jesus. So that's 4 first-century sources that talk about 5 Christian leaders that are being martyred.
Sure, but I think there's also a very fair question about what exactly is the cause of conflict. I don't think anybody just, it takes a while before the phenomenon of killing people for identifying with the name Christian to start happening. Normally there's some very specific, point of conflict between persecuted people and their persecutors. And it looks like when you're talking about Paul, I'm not necessarily sure if the thing that causes all of his persecution is specifically related to his Christology. It looks like it has a lot to do with the fact that he's getting punished in synagogues. He's also getting punished by Roman officials. Romans, it takes them much longer than Paul's own lifetime to organize any sort of organized resistance against the label of Christian. So it looks like there's actually a lot more happening here with disturbing the peace, with arguing about Torah, with maybe defaming the temple. Defaming the temple comes up in all of the gospel narratives. So I think it might be a bit more complicated than saying that, well, they're proclaiming the resurrection, and that's exactly what's getting them persecuted. I'm just not sure.
Okay, but I haven't said that.
Okay.
Why are they out proclaiming? Okay, so Josephus talks about how there were many messianic figures during his lifetime. And as the Romans killed those figures, well, then their followers just dispersed and they found another one, right, to follow. Why is it that once they kill Jesus, you've got the disciples that they continue? In fact, they get emboldened now and they go out and they continue to proclaim the message of Jesus, which included his death, his resurrection, and all these other things about what happens with the law and where salvation is found and the temple cult and all that kind of stuff. But the basic news about Jesus, about who he was, he's Messiah, about who he was and why he came, and his resurrection was the basic gospel message. And how we can, how we relate to God now through him rather than the temple cult. So, but why do that and remain with him as if they knew he was dead?
Well, I'm not. That is not my point at all. That is my point at all. Is not
they believe
that
he rose from the dead, and that's why they're out doing it. So, whereas you don't have the Romans and the Jews saying, "We're going to kill you because you believe Jesus rose from the dead," that's not why. But they're out doing what they're doing because they believe Jesus rose from the dead.
No one is arguing that they aren't convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. No one is arguing that that's not a central claim of the early Christian church. Of course it is. I'm just saying that that is different from saying that that is something that their persecutors would have necessarily known about them. So did Paul know that this was the central claim of Christians? I don't know that he did. I don't know that I don't know that that's what would have stirred him up against this. It looks like he was sort of doing this a little bit under the table. That's more my concern. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that straight out of the gate, very early on, Christians started proclaiming the death and resurrection of Jesus. There's no question about that. The question I have is that something that Paul got from Christians? Is that a claim Paul got from Christians? I just don't know. I'm just not sure if there's good evidence for that.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know that we can know exactly why Paul was persecuting the Christians. I think we can be certain it's because he didn't like the message of Jesus, right?
Oh, he didn't like the message of Christians. It seems like when Stephen comes around, it's like the temple is very involved in some early Christian preaching, and that creates a problem. Of course, Jesus is famous for trashing the temple right before he died, so it seems like some anxiety about the temple and its stability is involved. I think there's probably a variety of factors, but I think that when we're talking about the life of Paul, I don't know if the idea that he had some sort of solid knowledge of early Christian doctrine before he confirmed, that's something I'm just not so sure about. So, or even, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I want to talk more about the differences in methodology, because I think that's kind of like the core of the differences between the two of you. And to me, I see kind of a middle ground. And so let me know what your thoughts are, both of you. So Mike, it seems to me like I'm a philosophy guy. You two, well, Mike, historian, and Laura, theologian. Would you call yourself a historian as well, Laura?
I would definitely call myself a historian. Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, coming from your perspectives, you're both entrenched in history, and I'm more of a philosophy guy. So here's a way that I think
a lot of my work was in the philosophy of history.
Yeah, that's
there you go. So Mike, would you call yourself an evidentialist in the philosophical sense?
What do you mean? Tell me what you mean by evidentialist, so that we're all clear on that.
So what I mean by that is that your beliefs about something, or to be more technical, your credences ought to not surpass the available evidence that you have. So whatever the evidence is that you've got to proportion your beliefs to the evidence. Would you accept that view?
No, not necessarily. I guess then you could say, well, what constitutes evidence? There is evidence outside of historical evidence, of course. I think that Laura would be absolutely correct if she's saying, we could sense Christ's presence and believe that he rose from the dead. I'm fine with that. It's just
Laura,
as a historian, I'm interested in the question, what can we, if we take a look at it purely as historians, what kind of conclusions can we look at? And is it rational to believe the resurrection? And is there sufficient evidence to think, as a historian, that he rose from the dead? That's kind of where my interest is there. So,
okay, well then maybe there's not a middle ground. It's just that everyone's on the same ground. Well, let me ask my question to Laura. So, would you accept that thesis, or would you reject it? What I called evidentialism. Evidentialism.
I guess I don't know enough about the technical terminology to want to sign on the dotted line. Can you give me a concrete example from the Gospels, maybe?
I'm gonna be honest. I'm so bad at coming up with examples on the spot.
It's okay.
I'm like the worst person in the world for this task. Well,
you see, Laura, he's a philosopher, so he studies the questions nobody's asking.
Okay.
Exactly. Well, so let me put it this way. So I think that it sounds to me, Laura, like you're saying that, okay, history is important, but it can't get us all the way. And so it's more just about like having faith in Christ is the most important thing. And if we get if we put too much of an emphasis, or we think that apologetics or historical investigation is too important, that's going to be bad or detrimental potentially in the long run, because the historical side of things is just not there. It's not gonna get you there.
I think that's probably roughly it, except I don't quite agree with the characterization of where faith comes from. Okay. I think that just the general issue with this is that the historical data for knowing that Jesus was resurrected in the way that we confess him right now, the historical data is just not there. So I think that's a really big problem for this. And the bigger methodological problem is, from a Christian perspective, is that this treats Jesus as though he's a lot deader than he actually is, right? If we're sort of treating this as this 2,000-year-old historical event akin to the Jewish war that we have to go back and dig up and go find, that's not really how Christianity works. Christianity is a lot more about the sacraments and the church and the community. So I think that.
So tell me then. So if you don't think that the history can take you all the way, so help me. Like, what fills in the gap? Because you're a Christian, you're a confessing Christian. So if the history can't do it, like what takes you the rest of the way?
Yeah, so I think that the classic example of how to be a Christian is from Paul. So, Paul is a person who was doing just fine in life. He was progressing in Judaism beyond his years, and he had this revelatory out of nowhere experience that changed everything for him, and it changed his perspective on the way everything needed to go. And what Paul did not do was go perform some forensic analysis to go figure out whether this thing he just saw, or this vision he just saw, or this person he just saw, he did not go back to confirm whether or not this was whether or not a historical resurrection had happened, or whether or not he could accord this with what people who knew Jesus in life could. These are all things that as moderns we probably all wish he had done, but he just didn't. He just headed off to the desert, and he was there for 3 years, and he didn't really bother about seeing any of the disciples for another 3 years. And then when he did, it was only 2 weeks. So I think that generally this is the example of what it means to be a Christian, is that faith is either given to you or it isn't. And when God does give you faith, it's the thing that changes your life. It's the thing that you respond to. It's the thing that you turn around from. So I think that's a big part of why I'm not a big fan of going back and looking for this historical reference for the resurrection, just because it seems very out of character and out of step with how Paul did things. So,
I agree with you, Laura. I agree with you when you say through historical investigation, we cannot get to Jesus rose and the way we confess him. I agree with that, but I do think historical investigation can get to Jesus rose, but historical investigation cannot make theological conclusions. And you say Paul didn't go back to verify after his experience of the risen Jesus. He didn't go back to verify that he had actually risen, that there was an empty grave, an empty tomb. I think if I had an experience like Paul, I wouldn't need to do that either. But that's, I think, is beside the question. It's not whether what Paul had to go back and do. Paul, I think we both agree that the evidence strongly suggests that Paul had an experience that convinced him beyond any doubt that Jesus had been raised and had appeared to him. And so he does seem, at least in my view, I think we can show that there's good reason to think that Paul believed that Jesus was raised physically, bodily, that would have left behind an empty grave of some sort, and that this is what the Jerusalem apostles believed. So the question, I think, for the historian, and the one that Dale Allison asked, is what on earth or in heaven would have led them to believe that Jesus had been raised physically, bodily from the dead? That, Allison says, is the prize puzzle of New Testament research. And I think that's where, as historians, we have to then formulate hypotheses, weigh hypotheses, and see which one is the best explanation. So we don't have to stop at just saying, well, Paul believed, that the disciples believed. And I'm not saying that our faith is dependent. I want to be clear there, because I think I don't want to be misunderstood by you here. I don't think our faith needs to be dependent on whether we can prove with reasonable certainty, what we mean by prove here, not absolute, but whether we can show that the evidence strongly suggests that Jesus rose from the dead. I don't think that our faith needs to be dependent on that. Now, if the evidence pointed away from Jesus' resurrection, then I don't know that I could remain a Christian. But I don't need the resurrection to be confirmed in order to be a Christian. But as a historian, I'm interested to see whether it can be confirmed, and that's why I think that it does. One other
Laura,
quick thing.
Go ahead.
And that is, you're married, I'm married, Cameron's married.
Yep.
Have you read the book, The 5 Love Languages?
Long time ago.
Okay.
I've heard about it, and we've talked about it. Yeah.
Great book. Read it. It saved my marriage. And years ago, it saved my marriage. Just a great book, and it talks about how there's like 5 major different love languages, and we all have a primary one in which we like to be loved. And a lot of times your spouse is speaking a love language, like my wife would love me with her love language, but it wasn't my love language, so I never felt loved, and vice versa. And so I think there's the same thing to be said about truth languages. And some of us really don't need evidence, or it's not as important to some of us as others. For me, I didn't need evidence to become a Christian, but when I started having doubts, I needed evidence to remain a Christian. Now, it's not that way with everyone. My dad never doubted. Bill Craig told me he's never doubted since he's become a Christian. But I'm different. I'm wired differently. I doubt at times. I want evidence. I need evidence. So that's why this interests me as a historian. I don't have any problems with people who don't need it or don't place the same value on it as I do. It's just I'm wired differently.
And I think there's a big disagreement between the two of you on how much history can actually prove about the stuff that's relevant to like an argument for Christianity from the resurrection. But Laura, I wanted to give you the last thoughts, and then we can move to some Q&A. How does that sound?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I am definitely empathetic with the idea that some people really just need there to be great historical data for this. But I think the problem is that it's just. Sorry, that was a very condescending way of putting it. I did not mean it to come. It sounded condescending coming out of my mouth. That's not what I meant. I don't blame people for wanting there to be really good historical data that the resurrection happened. I don't blame people for wanting that at all. I mean, but it's just, I just don't think it's given to us. I just don't think it's what we have. I think there's excellent historical data for, well, not excellent. I mean, everything when you're talking about 1-2 sources 2,000 years ago it's all right. But I think we can have a lot of data about what kind of a person Jesus was. But I think when we're getting to the question of the resurrection, we can really get as far back as Paul, and that's in Paul's inner circle, or at least what Paul tells us his inner circle said, and that's all we have. And I think it's okay for us to be honest about that. I think sometimes we foreground this stuff as this sort of like way of getting people in the church doors, and I just don't think I just don't think it's good enough. So I think it's okay for us to be honest about this. So yeah, I don't know. That's sort of my take on that. But
all right. Well, we've got a lot of questions that have popped up, and I'm sure that it'll give us an opportunity to have some more back and forth. So this one is just a very nice comment from Sentinel Apologetics. Thank you for your super chat. He says, "I love you both, Mike and Laura. God bless."
Thanks.
So are you familiar with him? He's got a YouTube channel, I think, pretty popular, and he's done some work with Michael Heiser and some other scholars. He's got a really cool podcast or YouTube channel rather. So I'm actually scrolling down here to find the next super chat, and I've got it. It's from Pelagia. I always pronounce it wrong. He says, "What is the?" And you probably are familiar with him, yeah, and his wife or girlfriend.
Mm-hmm. Girlfriend, I think. Yeah.
Well, what is the source? His question is, what is the source for Polycarp or Clement being disciples of Jesus' disciples? Do they say so themselves? Probably a question for Mike.
Well, Polycarp doesn't say it, neither does Clement in either of their letters, okay? But you would have some later church fathers who would say it. I believe Irenaeus says it, and there are a number of different, I just don't know them right off. I do have it in my book, my large book on Jesus' resurrection, The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach. I think it's chapter 3 where I assess various sources, and I go over some of the apostolic fathers and assess Clement and Polycarp and the sources we have that talk about them.
Laura, you can feel free to comment if you'd like on that or not.
I don't really have a lot. I mean, I do know some people who argue that the Polycarp letter is pseudepigraphical, but that's... I don't have a lot to add to that, and that's something people have thought about. So it's also always hard when you're, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was just gonna say we were talking about this before we went live. It's this setup, this scene here has the halo behind you, perfect. It's like the little cross or it looks like a what are those called? I was actually at a Catholic church recently. Icons. It looks like an icon. All right. Anyways, let's move on. So from Sigfredo, I'm so bad with names. Here it is. Here's this question. Thank you for your super chat. In the accounts of religions from Buddhism to Shinto, symbolic figures utilize miracles. History honestly does portray existence of Jesus, Christianity. Miracles are the footprint. Let me see. Yeah, miracles are the footprint of the Messiah or the figures. It's a very difficult worded question.
Yeah, I have no idea what that was.
Yeah, Let me try it one more time. In the accounts of religions from Buddhism to Shinto, symbolic figures utilize miracles. Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. History honestly does portray existence of Jesus / Christianity. Are miracles the footprint of the Messiah or the figures? Symbolic figures. I don't know. Feel free to comment on that as best you can.
Maybe he's saying that there are other religious figures who are claimed to have done miracles? I mean, that's sure.
Yeah, are miracles
absolutely correct?
Are miracles the footprint of the Messiah?
I mean, the role of miracles changes from John to the Synoptics quite a bit. In the Synoptics, I think it seems to indicate more that this new era has come in, that, the kingdom of God is at hand is the language, and the finger of God is among you. And then John takes over this discourse of signs, right? Where the signs seem to have less to do with what time it is, theologically speaking, for lack of a better term, and more to do with an indication of who Jesus actually is. They're a sign that points to God and who he is. So I think there's a bit of a change in the role that, it looks like early Christians had more than one way of thinking about the relationship between Jesus as Messiah and miracles. So yeah, that's so I don't think there's one way to formulate it.
Yeah,
all right,
I'd
so
also
here's
look at it and say that the miracles, you've got like Hananiah ben Doza or Honi the Circle Drawer and Apollonius of Tyana and several others, but these are usually more than a century, more than 125 years after the events they purport to describe, many times much longer. When we come to the Gospels or the miracles of Jesus, it's multiply attested. It's in every layer of the Gospel tradition. It's in Mark. It's in Q, or at least you could say the Q material. Even if you throw out Q, you still got Luke. Like if
Something
Laura
like Q.
is correct, and you've got Luke using Matthew, so it's in Matthew. So it's in Mark, it's in Matthew, it's the special L material. It's in Josephus. It's in John. So it's multiply attested, and it's in parabolic, apocalyptic, and didactic forms, so it's in multiple literary forms. Even Mark Goodacre likes multiple attestation when you can show it, and I definitely think we've got this here with the miracles of Jesus. So, in fact, Graham Twelftree says that the miracles of Jesus is one of the very best attested historical things in his life. That doesn't mean they're divine miracles, but it does show that Jesus was known to perform deeds that astonished crowds and that were interpreted as miracles during his lifetime.
Okay, here's a question from Sarah Rainey. She says, she has a quote from you, Laura. She says, and the goal of lay-level apologetics is to feel personally vindicated and humiliate others. Do you still feel this way? Is this a comment that you've made?
This was a Twitter thread I posted a while ago after being kind of frustrated with people. People love to send me stuff they find on the internet and just have me fact check it for them, which is very demoralizing after a while. And I think the thing that I was getting increasingly frustrated by, especially because after a while people would start coming to me, is it seemed like it was getting very, and this is something that I noticed. So, I grew up in sort of the, I graduated from high school in 2007. So I mean, apologetics was a huge part of my high school experience and the way that we talked about getting ready for college. And I was constantly under the impression that what we were training to do, and I think you see this in things like the God's Not Dead movies and in a lot of, the way that these things get thrown out there, that the idea is that you're training to go out there and beat somebody, right? That you are going to be facing the world, which is made up of these opponents who want to talk you out of something, and it is your job, not necessarily to convert them. Like, that's often not really the goal. It certainly isn't in some of the, in the discourse I've seen online. There's not, but the goal is to beat them, right? And this is just so opposed to the way that I think the Academy works at its best. When you have people who can be very vehement, there's nothing wrong with being really into a subject and being really animated and excited and aggressive about it. Lord knows that's kind of my thing because I am naturally a very loud person. But I think you can get this tendency where it's a lot more about this, Thunderdome approach to historical knowledge, and I just don't think that's the purpose of this stuff. So I think it can get really ugly really quickly, and I think there aren't enough people who are leading these conversations that are interested in stopping that. So that's just a concern I have.
Would you say that you were being a little hyperbolic there?
Oh no, I mean, I'm trying.
Well, when
really
you say the goal of lay-level
really
apologetics.
I'm trying really hard not to name names. I think there are definitely some people who that's the goal. I think there are definitely people who that's the goal, and they have very big audiences because this is satisfying for them. So, yeah.
Do you get that? Yeah. I mean, I suspect you don't get that impression from Mike.
No, I truly no. And like I worked for Pete Williams for a summer when I was in grad school. I think he's a great guy. Like I know lots of wonderful people who do this. And Bart Ehrman is one of my teachers, and he's on more on the counter side. But these are debates he does, and he's a wonderful teacher. I think he's a terrific person to have in the academy. No, this is not so okay. Hyperbolic in scale of the problem. It's not everybody. But the people who do practice this, who do have this more Thunderdome approach to scholarship, I think it's really destructive. So, yeah.
All right. We have another question along the same lines. It says from Aiden Peterson. He says, hey, guys, Laura, who are the apologists, quote-unquote apologists you have in mind when you claim that they think history can deal in certainty? Could you give some names?
I can't remember what this is referring to. A lot of this is also just reflecting on my days as as somebody who was really interested in apologetics when I was in high school and college, where I think that a lot of what was happening is that the goal was to give us something to put our faith in, that could be really, rock solid, and also that nobody would ever be able to challenge and nobody would ever be able to take away. And I think that's just not something that can actually happen when you have when you're talking about tentative conclusions, which is at best what history can give us. So I'm not again, I'm really trying to not turn this into a call-out session, but I think there are a lot of curriculums and shows that do sort of promise this. And again, I'm not always schooled in who the stars are right now. A lot of this is based on my experience 5-10 years ago, and then I think. I kind of got infamous for reviewing Case for Christ, my podcast, but I think that's a great example. I think a lot of times why these things are so popular is they promise to give you something that can't be touched by the dark night of the soul or doubt. And I just don't think that's the case. I just don't think that's what Christianity's about.
Do you think the Case for Christ does that, or any of Strobel's books?
It's so hard to separate Case for Christ and its reception history, to be honest. So those are definitely different. But I think by virtue of framing the whole thing as a case, basically, that the whole thing is being framed as sort of a court case, and court cases do have decisive ends. I think there's definitely something to be said for that. That's part of the approach. Or at least this sort of.
Do you think that's bad?
I think it's not realistic. I think it's just not a big part of what being a Christian is. I think it's just, a lot of Christianity is about doubt, and not doubt, but I think a lot of Christianity is about ambiguity and not necessarily knowing where God is when X happens. I think that's a big part of it. So, and I think we need to be honest that is a lot of people's experience of Christianity, and it would be really nice if we could package a form of Christianity that didn't include the unpleasant bits, but that's just not how it works.
I don't see Strobel as doing that in his book. He is dealing with.
Let me just reference what we're talking about here, because we're talking about. You said that apologists deal in certainty, and so that's what we're talking about when it comes to Strobel's books and his work and everything.
Yeah, I know Lee. I know Lee personally. He's a real humble guy, actually, which if I'd sold as many copies of my books as he has, I'd have a head that couldn't fit, on the screen. He's an amazingly humble guy. But the background he's coming from was he was an atheist legal journalist for the Chicago Tribune. So as a legal journalist trained at Yale, master's degree in legal journalism at Yale, he is approaching this as through law, and he's not trying to prove it beyond all doubt. He's still got things in mind like reasonable doubt, or that would be in a criminal case. But of course, in a civil case, you're looking preponderance of evidence, and it was the preponderance of evidence that did convince him. And he just made a case for why he thinks the evidence suggests that Christianity is true. And Laura, you've made a case on why you think we shouldn't make a case. for Christianity to be in truth. So, I mean, we're all making cases. It's just, I think we're wired differently. Strobel was wired that way. He needed evidence because he was an atheist. His marriage was blowing up because his wife had become a Christian when she had been an atheist. She became a Christian not based on any evidence, but he wanted to disprove it. He wanted to check it out and see if it were true. And so he did do a journey. It wasn't like exactly in the case for Christ. He admits that that was kind of, narrative, that he turned his own investigation into some narrative and some things like this. But he did look at the evidence for 2 years. He looked at the evidence, and he kicking and screaming, he became a Christian. And I know some others like Abdu Murray, who was an attorney a Muslim attorney in Detroit, and he resisted, but he was convinced by the resurrection of Jesus to become a Christian. I'm still a Christian today because of the evidence. So it's just for some of us, that's just the way we're wired, I think. So
well, to be fair,
there
are some,
both as historians, we just have different desires.
To be fair, there is an entire branch of Christian apologists who promote this kind of like brand of certainty, and those are presuppositionalists. Presuppositionalists do that a lot. So there's a Seitan Bruggencate, I think. Yeah, which we're not on this channel.
No.
Yeah, so to be fair, there are some people like that, but that's not Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel is not a presuppositionalist, and none of the circles that I run in tout that view. Anyways, let's move on. We've got another question from Paul. He says, "What is preventing the gospel group appearances reports from being legendary?"
Well, we can't necessarily verify any of them, but I would say we do seem like from Paul's testimony in 1 Corinthians 15, from that oral tradition that probably goes back to the apostles, that there were 3 group appearances at least that are mentioned, to the 12, to more than 500, to all the apostles. And you do have some that are multiply attested, I think. So, I mean, again, I'm going to just part with Laura on and say you've got some independence of John from the synoptics, and you've got group appearances, like you've got the appearance to the one where the first group appearance that's mentioned, Judas was absent. Now, I think that this is the first group appearance that is mentioned by Luke in Luke 24 that occurs in Jerusalem. And I'm also very convinced, as I argue for in my book on gospel differences, that the appearance to the disciples in Galilee in Matthew, I think that's the same appearance that Luke is reporting and that John is reporting that happened in Jerusalem. Why Matthew has it in Galilee, I have no idea. So I do think there's some multiply independently attested group appearances, but I mean, I can't prove all of them. Like the one by the Sea of Galilee in John 21, that's only attested by John. So, yeah.
Yeah, I don't
thoughts,
know.
Laura?
I actually don't know if I want to call it a multiple attestation of the Matthew 28, the appearance at the mountain in Galilee, versus being in the upper room in Luke. Those actually seem like pretty radically different stories to me, and especially because the purpose of the stories is very dissimilar. I mean, you have the commissioning in both, but it seems a lot more about assuring the disciples to not be afraid in Luke. So I guess I'm just not so sure that here's the thing. I think whenever you're talking about stories that have one version of them that is written down, that you have one accounting to it, kind of the least interesting thing we can ask about it is, did it happen or not? Because there's just not a lot to go on. There's just not a lot to weigh. So when you're talking about the Great Commission in Matthew, I actually think that and again, this is part of my other issue with kind of the way that we sort of do this very history-centered faith thing is, the least interesting thing we can ask about that is did that happen? I actually think there's a lot more to be said about, what happened? Why or like what is Matthew envisioning here with the fact that some people doubt even though they see Jesus, or going into all nations, and the fact that Matthew puts this in the same book as Matthew 10 that says, go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I think there's so many really interesting questions we can ask about this stuff that really misses that we kind of skip right past if we just kind of zero in on the did that happen thing or not. I just think the vast majority of historical work doesn't focus on that specific question because there's a lot of interpretation to be done.
Again, the difference between a theologian and a historian. But in terms of the doubt, I think that one's fairly easily reconciled. And again, I'm not going to get into a lot of it here, of course, but I do deal with it in my book on gospel differences. When Matthew says in Matthew 28, I believe it's verse 17, they saw Jesus came to them and said, some worshipped, but others doubted. The word distazo there is only used one other time in Matthew. It's when Peter's walking on water and he sees the waves and the wind, and then he begins to sink. And Jesus rescues him and he says, why did you doubt? Well, Peter was believing, but he was also doubting at the same time because he's out walking on water. He does have some faith, but he has some second thoughts. And distazo does mean to think two things. Literally, it means to think two things. And one of the reasons I think that Luke is narrating the same experience is because when Jesus appears, it says they saw him, and out of joy and amazement, they were unbelieving, apistos, no belief. Yet they felt joy and amazement. They were apistos, unbelieving. I think that these terms are being used. Luke is just using a stronger term than Matthew. It's like, look, both my parents are dead, but if they showed up at the door, I buried them both. I know they're dead. But if they showed up at the door and I'm hugging them and smelling them, and it's like, yeah, this is them. And they said, Mike, God sent us back just for a couple hours to encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. Something like that. It's like out of joy and amazement. It's unbelievable. I think this is how Luke is using that term. And when he says they worship, but some doubted, they're thinking two different things. It's like, wow, the worst thing that had just happened a few days ago, but how can this be? But it is. So I don't think it's like they've got their arms crossed and lips pursed and thinking, I'm not really sure about this. I think that Matthew's using that term in a different sense.
Did you want to come back on that at all, Laura?
Not much. I guess what I would have to say is what prevents it from being a legendary account. I don't know what does prevent it, but I think there's a lot, but I don't think that makes it, the fact that we can't really know where these stories came from, I think that's okay. I think that's not something that we need to really be stressed out as Christians, but yeah, as historians, there's just not a lot more to ask about it, I think. So.
Yeah.
Now, I'd like to add one further thought, if I might. I can't prove that it's not legend, but it's not a matter of, there is a scale, a historical scale of certainty, you could say. In the middle is indeterminate, and then you go up, in increasing certainty or decreasing or increasing uncertainty to a point where you say, well, this didn't happen. The evidence is there to show that, to say this didn't happen. So, whereas I might not be able to prove that there's no legendary elements in it, I do look and I'd say, well, okay, when I look at let's just take John's gospel, I do think that the evidence suggests that John is rooted in eyewitness testimony. Now, personally, I go with the traditional authorship of John. I'm in the minority. I'm in a small minority there. Okay, but the majority of critical scholars still think that John is rooted in the eyewitness testimony of a minor disciple. And if that's the case, wow, you probably got the testimony of a minor disciple who's talking about this appearance that he personally saw. So I can't prove that it's not legendary, and I'm not saying that it's been verified historically. But I wouldn't just go and say, well, this is legend.
All right, let's move on to another question from Joshua LeClaire. He says, Laura, what would be required to share Mike's view? What is missing historically for you?
Just, that we can historically prove the resurrection. I think for one thing, I think that methodological naturalism is a bit underrated for historical research. I think that this is, I think it takes a lot of heat because of the way in which it gets lumped in with ontological naturalism, which I don't think it has to be at all. I think it's a very useful tool for doing things. But again, if we're just talking about if saying that we found a good historical record for this completely anomalous event where a person was definitely dead and then they definitely weren't, more than one witness, honestly, more than one textual witness has survived. I think that would be really useful. More than one firsthand account. Ideally, lots of them. It almost never happens that we get a bunch of witnesses for something in history, but when we're talking about that long ago. But no, I'd be willing to talk about a pterodactyl flying over London 500 years ago if 500 people all independently wrote about it. It seems insane, but anomalous. But I'd be willing to hear about it and talk about it. So maybe if we had more of those 500 people who saw Jesus, I think that would be worth talking about. So, yeah.
You do think that Paul believed it, right?
Oh, no, there's no doubt. Yeah,
so you go with Paul, but I hear you saying one source. Now, that might be one written source we have, but would you agree that this is also what the Jerusalem apostles are teaching?
They what they say about hearsay in court, but
yeah. I thought you didn't like court, like the case for Christ. You don't like court stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm playing. But no, I think when we're talking about the I definitely think, the Jerusalem apostles were teaching the resurrection. It looks like this is a belief that becomes very normative very quickly. But again, the doctrine of the resurrection, the concept of the resurrection, I think that is a little bit, that's at least a little bit distinct from saying that, Jesus was definitely dead and then he definitely wasn't.
But they're at least saying, you admit that they were saying, they believe, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Do you believe that they believed Jesus rose and had appeared to them?
Yeah, it sounds like they definitely believe that Jesus had appeared to them. It sounds like they definitely believe that.
So even if we just had Paul, you would still think the evidence is sufficient to conclude that even the Jerusalem apostles, at least Peter, James, and John, as well as Paul, all believed that Jesus rose and had appeared to them.
Yes, I think if we're going to talk about a historical resurrection, though, that is very different from saying, a historical vision, right? It kind of looks like that's about as far as we can get with that. We're saying that the Jerusalem disciples were very sure that Jesus appeared to them. We don't really know what form that took because we don't have their account of it. So I think it would be one thing to have more than one, to talk about Jesus.
You think John is independent of Paul, right?
Sorry?
You think John is independent of Paul?
I think there's I think John is probably dependent on the Synoptic Gospels.
But even completely dependent?
On the Synoptic Gospels, I think John is using Synoptic Gospels. I think that's
okay.
Probably,
well, at least one of the tradition. All right, I don't agree with that, but at least one of the traditions in the Synoptic Gospels would be independent of Paul, right? Or do you think it's all coming from Paul?
Well, Paul is definitely the big voice of early Christianity, isn't he? If we think that Mark is working from Paul's scholarship, I think basically the entire New Testament is responding to Paul's theology in some way. I don't think that's quite the same thing as saying that everyone is just dependent on Paul for all this. Because I don't want this to get overstated. My point is not that. My point is not that Paul personally is the only guy with a resurrection account, and then all reports come from that. I don't think that's I don't think that's the case. But it's different to say that that a lot of these early people in these Christians in early churches were having these experiences of Jesus appearing to them. That's very different from saying that Jesus was definitely alive again. I think that's a really different claim. And it's just, it might sound like splitting hairs, but I actually think when we're talking about something as significant as a person was dead and then he wasn't, this is the kind of thing you really need. So, that's...
I agree with you. It is a different thing. No question about that. Where we disagree is I think we can go further and ask the question, what led them to that belief? What was the nature of those experiences? What led the early disciples to have that belief that Jesus had risen and had appeared to them? And then we can take the known data and then weigh competing hypotheses to see which one best explains. That's where I would go further than you on this.
Sure, but we almost never know what causes visionary experiences in history, and that's just not really something that historians can recover. We don't know what caused the Salem witch trials, for instance. There has been a modernist push to blame it on, wheat algae, but that's not quite it. There has been a push to blame, we don't know what caused Hildegard's visions. People have said that it was caused by migraines, but that's not something we necessarily know. I think there's a lot of different, things that could be behind these things, but oftentimes we just don't know what caused visions.
True, but we would just question the cause. We wouldn't question the fact that the person had visions or that the Salem witch trials actually occurred.
Right, of course. But also, right. But I think the analogy here is no one is questioning that the early church happened. No one is questioning that the early church had this, mission and calling and purpose. No one is denying that that's what happened. The question is, can this only be explained by Jesus having actually definitely come back from the dead? I think there's lots of other things that could explain it. I think Jesus came back from the dead, but I don't think that's something that we necessarily arrive at from history.
Well, I agree with you that there are various explanations that can be offered for it, but that's where the task of the historian is to weigh those hypotheses critically using criteria such as explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, less ad hoc, to see which hypothesis best explains the data. And when we do, we find that there is a huge disparity in the ability of the hypotheses to account for those data. Resurrection wins by a huge margin.
Well, how would we test that, though? This is something I want to know. Is because, it's not like we know what resurrections cause. We have no analogous experience of somebody being resurrected and saying, the people who saw this resurrected person, definitely then this happened to them, so this must have been the effect that the resurrection had on them. So I think that I think that that's a little bit of an overstatement, because we just don't know how most people would be affected by the sight of seeing a revivified person. I'm just not sure that that's clear. So
remember, I'm not saying that as a historian we can show that God raised Jesus. I'm fine with saying Jesus was raised and leave the cause undetermined. But I do think the resurrection hypothesis explains the data far better than anything else, like hallucinations, metaphor, stolen body, anything like that. Disciples lied.
Yeah, I just don't know how we would test that. I think that's kind of the question is, what possible analogy would we have to the idea that the only thing that could have possibly explained this is a revivified person? We don't always know what causes movements that seem to grow very quickly. With Joseph Smith, it seems like Joseph Smith was able to amass a lot of followers very quickly. And from my perspective, it certainly seems like the golden tablets would be a much stronger explanatory power for how he was able to convince so many people so quickly than not having golden tablets, right? And that's But that's not something we think, right? Sometimes things happen in history that we're not necessarily sure of. So
this is why I think the whole conversation.
It's just a matter of which one best explains the data. We don't have to prove it beyond all doubt. It's which one best explains the data. So there can be various explanations, but it's the best explanation. That's
why I was saying earlier that I think this whole the majority of the disagreement is mainly about methodology, because Laura's like, how can we test that? And I think what Mike is saying is he has these criteria of like what a good explanation is, and he mentioned a couple of them, and then he says, well, we then look at we get our pool of explanations, and then we start to apply the criteria to the explanations, and then whichever one comes out the best, we label the best explanation. So here's my question, Mike. How do we know that the best explanation is the real explanation?
Well, we can't get to what we have to do is we look and okay. So when I'm weighing hypotheses, okay, I look at, let's say, the hallucination hypothesis, and I say, all right, what's the data that's virtually indisputable? All right, Jesus died by crucifixion. Shortly thereafter, a number of his followers had experiences they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. A skeptic named Paul persecuted the church, had an experience he believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus. What's the best explanation? Was it a hallucination? Well, look at that and say, no, the percentage of percipients is too high. Those bereaving the loss of a loved one, typically about 7%. You got 100% of the apostles with it. So the percentage of percipients is too high. 2, you got group appearances. That's problematic. 3, you got Paul. He's not grieving. 4, you've got the fact that typically a hallucination doesn't of a dead one. My dad experienced a hallucination of my mom after she died, but he didn't conclude that her grave was empty. People don't conclude bodily resurrection when they had experienced a hallucination of their loved one. So it doesn't account for things like the group appearances, the appearance to Paul, and the, that all of them would have had to experience a hallucination. So it lacks explanatory scope. Given the truth of the hallucination hypothesis, we wouldn't expect all of them to experience hallucination. We wouldn't expect Paul to experience one. We would expect the Christian movement to dissolve and just possibly be a footnote in future history books. That's not what happened. It became the number one world religion. So it lacks explanatory power. It's implausible because it would require mass hallucinations, which the mental health profession would seem to suggest they can't happen. And it does seem, if you're going to try to make it fit, then it becomes ad hoc. The resurrection hypothesis comfortably explains Jesus' death, the appearance to individuals, to groups, to friend and foe, why they believed he had been raised physically. Given the truth of the resurrection hypothesis, we expect the very kinds of things that we get. Plausibility, that becomes the question mark there. But if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, well, then the resurrection becomes extremely plausible, right? So I think we can't assume God exists or wanted to raise Jesus. I think we want to remain worldview independent here and open, and we just put an inscrutable here. And I don't see an ad hoc component. So weigh in the number one hypothesis offered by critics today versus the resurrection hypothesis. By strictly controlled historical method, I think we show that the resurrection hypothesis by far surpasses the hallucination hypothesis. So,
Laura, here's a question that I have for you. If you don't want to go all the way to say that, like, we could confirm with, however much degree of certainty that the resurrection happened based on just purely historical grounds, but could you agree at least this much with Mike in that maybe the evidence is good enough to make it reasonable?
So, I mean, here's part of the issue, I think, was sort of like crossing things off the list, right? That, the idea that, so for one thing, that, we have 100% participation in this vision. Well, we actually only ever see Peter, James, and John in Paul's reporting. We don't actually see the other 12, and also we couldn't have 100% participation among the 12 anyways because Judas is dead. So that's, so once we're getting into this more, and then he appeared to the 12, this more legendary, this more, creedal, traditional material. I'm not totally sure if we want to say that's definitely, all the disciples are present and accounted for. They definitely all saw it. But I also think that part of the issue here, too, is that, all this is being told retrospectively. All this is being told in narration past. So, my husband and I love ghost shows. We're always watching these like ghost hunter shows. And one thing that I've noticed a lot in people in my life who have seen things that they think are aliens, things they think are ghosts, is that the way that they narrate these things after the fact, they interpret strange and confusing, bizarre experiences through their own present experience and through what's available to them. So the fact that Paul is narrating this stuff, he's having other forces in his life shaping how he narrates this besides just this vision. I actually don't know if we know for a fact that this thing that he saw or the person he saw was exactly the same thing as what Peter, James, and John saw. We just have this narration well after the fact that they all kind of came to agree with each other. And I also, I think when you get to this final bit here that, the most important thing is that, once we assume that there is a resurrecting God involved, and once we believe that there is a God who loves us and who loves Jesus involved, then of course this becomes a lot more plausible. Amen. Hallelujah. That's great. It's just not history, right? Like, this has been more of this, this is a theological presupposition we're making. But I think that for the most part, we're privileging a Christian cosmology there because it's our assumption, but this isn't really something we do for other faiths when we're talking as theologians, not as theologians, as sociologists or historians. We can go down to Mexico right now and find people who are practicing Santeria and who say that they have cured all kinds of gynecological ailments or eye problems, and we could find lots of people who would attest to the fact that they have been helped by these Santeria practitioners. And I think we would all agree that, as Christians, we would not say, well, then the most likely thing is that, well, they were invoking this spirit that is particular to this one area who was active in the herb, and this must have been what happened because this is the context in which we would expect a Santeria-oriented miracle to happen. That's the kind of thing that a person who presupposes that religion says. So I think if we're talking about this a little bit if we're trying to be, equal opportunity worldview entertainers here, it's really hard to get to something like a resurrection if we don't have an agent who would do it. So that I think that's a bit of a concern. So yeah.
Do you mind if we leave it there and then we move on to more questions?
Sorry. Yeah.
No worries. All right. So I know that, Mike, you've got
clear. I didn't say that we should assume God exists and wanted to raise Jesus. I'd said that would need to be done. We'd have to show it if we wanted to show plausibility. I think the plausibility is actually inscrutable.
Yeah.
All right. So we have some more questions. Do you guys have any more time to stick around, or do we need to cut it short? Or not short, but do we need to? You guys,
I can take a few
have
minutes.
A couple.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can take a few. I don't want to speak for Mike. Yeah.
I can take 5 more minutes.
Okay, that sounds good.
5 more minutes. Okay. We'll get through as many as we can. So, a lightning round. All right. Camille Gregor says, "Is the master's thesis surveying scholarship on Peter being a source behind Mark publicly available?"
Oh, that's a great question.
Unfortunately, it is not. He just finished it. I've encouraged him to continue with it in his doctoral research, which he hopes to do. And I think it's 207 sources of critical scholars, but they're all English. So he wants to check out in his doctoral work what French, German, and some other sources, scholars in those other languages are saying. But I think 207 critical scholars since 1965 is a pretty good sampling. I'm going to try to interview him at some point, so you can be on the lookout in my YouTube channel to see if that comes out. But no, it's not published yet.
Name of your YouTube channel for people that want to go subscribe?
Just go to Mike Licona, and that'll come up with the channel.
Yeah, that's important. All right. Question from Ronald Mendonca. He says, "Thank you for your super chat, Ronald. Why didn't Jesus make sure that there were reporters there at the time? He's God, right?"
Why does God do anything?
That's right.
Because he's free to do what he wants. He's God. So.
All right, let's get to another question here from Biss W. "This is amazing. Top speakers. Please get Nathaniel Jensen, AIG Kinham, and Josh Swamidas to discuss human evolution. Jensen is doing a series." Well, it's a great recommendation, and we'll try to get to it later. Josh Swamidas has been on my channel a bunch of times. If you don't know who he is, he's an evolutionary.
He's a really good guy. Yeah.
He's awesome. He's so good.
Yeah.
He and I have sort of become friends on Facebook and stuff. All right, sorry, I'm scrolling down to find more. All right, so from Blake Junta, he says, 1 Corinthians 15 was apostle approved. What'd they see? L means, I guess, Laura.
I assume so. Apostle approved?
Yeah. 1 Corinthians 15 was apostle approved. What did they see?
Paul doesn't tell us much about what he saw. They saw Jesus, right? We don't know exactly what it was. We don't know. It's not clear if Paul touched Jesus, what form this took. But, yeah, they saw Jesus, and Paul is content to leave it at that.
All right, let's move on. Let's get to another question. Amir El Shafra, for both, what is the definition of faith? Does it entail evidence? And then he has, it looks like in Greek, and I don't know how to pronounce that.
Oh, pistis.
Pistis.
Yeah, that's what he has.
There you go,
yeah.
pistis.
Definition of pistis, yeah. I mean, faith, belief, yeah.
Oh, I was going to say faithfulness.
What's that? Yeah.
I was going to say faithfulness. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think faithfulness is a pretty good definition because it involves not just something that you affirm in your mind. It's like a speech act. You're also doing, you're following. It's like when Jesus says to believe in him, he's not just saying believe that, pray a prayer. When the rich man came to him and Jesus said, yeah, you lack one thing, just sell all you have, give to the poor, come follow me. And the guy walked away grieving because he had a lot. Jesus didn't say, oh, okay, now wait a minute, just come on down, kneel before me, pray this prayer, and at least get heaven's say settled for you. And discipleship's a process. No, he let the guy walk. He's looking for followers, not just people who will assent to certain beliefs.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say there's a classic objective subjective debate in Greek about whether or not the faith in Christ in Greek that Paul frequently writes it's better translated. It just literally means the faith of Christ. So there's some question over whether this means faith in Christ, objective, our faith in Christ, versus the faithfulness of Christ, the faithful actions that Christ has done on our behalf. We have a podcast about it, and I can't remember which episode it is, so just go looking for it. Yeah.
Yeah, and the link again to her podcast is in the description of the video, so you can just click it and get it right away. It's super easy. All right, this will be, I think, the last question for us today. 20 Faces. How would you describe, or how would you prove to a non-Christian that the resurrection occurred without focusing on historical evidence? And how do you come to have all this information of Jesus without studying history? Looks like a question for you, Laura.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at Paul, the vast majority of what Paul is talking about is not always history. It's the implications of the death and resurrection of Jesus, right? And that is something that is known outside of history. Paul thinks that Jesus died once for all and that he was raised never to die again. This is his conception of resurrection. So I think that all of this means that Jesus is the Jesus that Paul interacted with in his own lifetime is the same Jesus people are interacting with now. So I think that you can look back at the history of the way in which people have interacted with Jesus throughout history, and we can weigh it based on what is consistent with a God who would become human and die and be raised on our behalf. I think that tells you a great deal about the character of Jesus right there. So I think once we're talking about all those things, it can be, there's actually a lot we can learn about Jesus without, and again, I'm not saying that history is relevant to faith. I don't mean that at all. My point is just that faith cannot be proved with the tools of history, and these central articles of our faith, I think, lie beyond the bounds of history. So.
All right, well, here's one more comment, and this will close us out for today from Anthony Rowden. He says, thanks, Laura and Mike, for coming on. Hopefully we treated you nice, Laura.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you both for coming on to the channel. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I've really enjoyed it. It was fun to hear a kind of different perspective because, Laura, I think you have, at least in the circles that I run in, you have a very unique perspective. So it was great to have to hear you dialogue with Mike Licona. It's been really, really cool. Is there anything that you'd like to leave the audience with? I've already talked about your podcast, and that's linked in the description. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave with the audience?
I feel pretty content about it, so yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, how about you, Mike? What are your thoughts?
Well,
have you enjoyed the conversation?
Enjoyed this, Laura. This has been a fun dialogue. So I love talking shop, and
yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, please tell Mark Goodacre I said hello and my warm greetings to him. I really love the guy. He's just such a great guy.
He's a great man. Yeah.
And thank you, Cameron, for setting us up.
Absolutely. Thank you, Cameron.
No problem.
Yeah, no, I guess I was thinking about last things to say to the audience. But yes, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Cameron, for putting up with this.
No problem. All right.